A steel door closes with a heavy, final sound. Not the kind you see in movies, loud chaos, shouting, flashing lights, but a controlled, deliberate silence. Inside Tamms Correctional Center in southern Illinois, silence was part of the system. For years, this place held men the state called the most dangerous, in conditions designed not for rehabilitation, but for separation, from other prisoners, from staff, and often from normal human contact itself. Tamms wasn't just a prison. It was Illinois' Supermax, a closed world of concrete, policy, and near-total isolation. And then, after 15 years of controversy, it ended. In late December 2012, the last prisoners in the Supermax unit were moved out, and by early January 2013, Tamms was officially closed. But the bigger question remained. If this prison was built to protect society from the worst of the worst, why did Illinois shut it down? And what did Tamms reveal about how the American system uses extreme isolation? This documentary explores the real, verified history of Tamms Correctional Center, one of the most debated prisons in modern American corrections. We will break down why it was built, how it operated as Illinois' only Supermax facility, and why it became a national symbol of long-term solitary confinement. We'll also examine the political battles, the legal and human rights pressure, and the public controversy that pushed the state toward closure. Everything in this story is based on documented events, official reports, and credible investigative records, including findings and statements from groups like the John Howard Association, Amnesty International, the ACLU, and Human Rights Watch, as well as the public record around Illinois' closure decision under Governor Pat Quinn. And to understand what Tamms was, we have to go back to the moment it became politically possible, even popular, to build a prison designed around isolation. This documentary is for educational and informational purposes only. All content is based on factual, research-driven information from public records, official documents, court filings, and reporting by reputable media and human rights organizations. No information is intentionally fabricated or exaggerated. Before we proceed, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. Tamms Correctional Center sits near the village of Tamms, in the southern tip of Illinois, a region far from Chicago, far from the media, and far from most of the families of the men held inside. The facility developed in two stages. First, a smaller minimum security section, and then the part that would define its name nationwide, the closed maximum security unit, known as CMEX. CMEX opened in 1998 as Illinois' Supermax prison. By design, Supermax prisons are not typical prisons. They are built to manage extreme risk, real or perceived, by removing prisoners from the normal population and placing them into long-term segregation. The stated goal is security, preventing assaults, stopping gang organization, and controlling individuals accused of repeated disruption. At Tamms, this logic became a blueprint. According to monitoring and advocacy reports, men at CMEX were typically held in single cells, separated from others for most of the day, with movement tightly controlled and social contact heavily restricted. Supporters argued it was necessary, that the state needed a place to contain people who could not safely be housed anywhere else. Critics argued it was something different, a prison that could hold a person in isolation for months, years, even longer, not always for a new crime, but for institutional reasons like suspected gang affiliation, internal discipline, or administrative classification. And that classification mattered, because Tamms didn't operate like a normal sentence. For many people held there, the question wasn't, how long is my sentence? It was, how long will I be kept in this unit? That uncertainty became central to the Tamms controversy, because in a Supermax, time isn't only punishment. It becomes pressure. Meanwhile, inside Illinois politics, Tamms served another role. It became proof that the state was tough. It represented control. And in an era shaped by fear of prison violence, it gave officials something they could point to, a facility made to contain the state's most disruptive prisoners, out of sight and away from the general population. But that same distance, the geographic isolation and the secrecy of the unit, created the conditions for a second story to grow, the story of what Tamms was doing to the people inside it. By the late 2000s, pressure had begun to build. Human rights organizations began looking closely at Tamms, and reports started to describe not only security policies, but severe mental health concerns and allegations that isolation itself was causing psychological deterioration. And then came the turning point. After years of growing scrutiny, the question stopped being, is Tamms harsh? And became something more dangerous to the prison's future. Was Tamms not only harsh, but unnecessary? And if it was unnecessary, why was Illinois still paying to keep it running? By the early 2010s, Tamms Correctional Center had become something more than a prison. It had become an argument. Supporters of Supermax prisons usually defend them with one main idea: control. If a small number of prisoners repeatedly cause violence or chaos, the state needs a place to contain them safely. But critics were now focusing on a different question. Was Tamms actually improving safety, or was it simply isolating people at enormous cost? Illinois was facing a serious budget crisis during these years. And as lawmakers looked for ways to cut spending, Tamms stood out. Not because it was the largest facility, but because it was one of the most expensive to run for the number of people it held. Even Illinois' own internal documents and oversight discussions began to frame Tamms as a financial issue as much as a correctional one. At the same time, a wider national debate was growing about long-term solitary confinement, and Tamms was frequently mentioned as an example of the Supermax model. Reports and investigations described a system where people could be held in strict isolation for long periods, with limited programming and minimal human contact. Advocacy groups argued that this kind of confinement could worsen mental health and make prisoners harder to safely manage over time, not easier. Now Tamms had two problems in the public eye: cost, the money it consumed in a struggling state budget; consequences, what isolation could do to the human mind over months and years. And then the political shift happened. In March 2012, Illinois Governor Pat Quinn proposed closing Tamms, along with other facilities, as part of a cost-saving plan. Human Rights Watch publicly supported the proposal, describing it as a step in the right direction, especially because of Tamms' Supermax function. Soon after, civil liberties groups were openly saying that closing Tamms could help Illinois reduce its use of long-term solitary confinement. But the proposal immediately hit resistance. For towns near prisons, a facility isn't just concrete and razor wire. It's jobs. And for corrections unions, closures mean layoffs, relocation, and political battles. In 2012, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSEM, fought the planned closure, and court action created delays and uncertainty around what would happen next. This is where Tamms' story becomes less like a prison documentary and more like a political chess match. Because the people inside Tamms were still there, still classified, still segregated, while lawyers, officials, and judges argued over whether the doors should even stay open. And then, in late 2012, the situation finally moved. A judge lifted the injunction blocking the closure, following an Illinois Supreme Court-related order discussed in news coverage at the time. Transfers began again, and the state started moving prisoners out of Tamms. The ending came quietly. According to Amnesty International, the last people held in Tamms' Supermax unit were transferred on December 28, 2012, specifically to Pontiac Correctional Center. And on January 4, 2013, Tamms was officially closed. But closure did not answer the deeper question. Because Tamms was not shut down after a single scandal or a single moment. It was shut down after years of argument over something harder to measure. What happens when a state builds a prison around isolation and then can't agree on what it accomplished? And if Tamms had been designed to contain the worst cases, what did it mean that Illinois eventually decided it could do without it? When Tamms closed in early 2013, the headlines focused on politics, budgets, and legal disputes. But for the people who lived under Tamms' rules, day after day, year after year, the story was never only about money. It was about what Supermax confinement does to a human being and what happens when a prison's main tool is separation. Tamms' closed maximum security unit was designed to reduce risk by limiting contact. In theory, the less interaction, the fewer opportunities for violence or coordination between prisoners. But critics argued that this approach had a second effect. It could also reduce accountability. Because in highly restricted environments, the public sees less, families see less, and outside oversight becomes harder. And when prisons run far from major cities, that distance can multiply the isolation, not only for the people inside, but for anyone trying to understand what is happening there. Over time, organizations like the John Howard Association of Illinois, a prison monitoring group, raised serious concerns about the conditions and the lack of normal human engagement in Supermax housing. Human Rights Watch and other groups argued that long-term solitary confinement could create or worsen mental health issues, especially for prisoners already vulnerable. The central claim was not that people in Supermax were innocent or harmless. The claim was that extreme isolation can alter behavior, and sometimes for the worse. And this became a turning point in the wider argument about Tamms. If the goal is security, then the question isn't only whether isolation limits violence in the short term. It's whether it produces people who are harder to manage in the long term. Because prisons don't exist outside time, most prisoners eventually transfer, or release, or move back into general population. So if isolation causes psychological damage or emotional instability, that damage doesn't stay inside one building. It moves with the person. In the years before closure, advocates increasingly pointed to Tamms as a place where people could remain in severe restrictions for extended periods without meaningful pathways out, creating a kind of administrative dead end. And this is where Tamms became symbolic. Not just a prison, but a question about the American system. How much isolation is too much? Who gets placed in it? And how does the state decide when it ends? The debate intensified as Tamms closure plans moved forward. Some officials and corrections voices warned that without Tamms, Illinois would struggle to control its most disruptive prisoners. But advocates argued the opposite, that Illinois had already begun shifting prisoners out, and that Supermax practices could be reduced without causing chaos if the state strengthened mental health care, classification review, and step-down programs. And then, once Tamms shut down, a new reality began. The prison was gone, but the problem was not automatically solved. Because prisoners from Tamms didn't disappear. They were transferred. Amnesty International notes the final transfers went to Pontiac Correctional Center. So the Supermax model didn't vanish overnight. Instead, the state had to answer a different question. If we close the building, where do the practices go? In other words, Tamms was not just a facility. It was a method. And methods can survive even after the doors close. That's what made Tamms so important in American correctional history. It forced Illinois and the public to look at a difficult reality. Sometimes, the most powerful punishment isn't physical. It's social. It's psychological. It's being removed from the normal world until the mind starts responding as if normal life no longer exists. And once people began thinking about that, it created the biggest turning point of all. Even after closure, the debate wasn't over whether Tamms should exist. It became a wider question. Should Supermax prisons exist at all? After January 2013, Tamms Correctional Center was no longer operating. But it didn't fade away. In many ways, Tamms became more powerful as an idea after it closed, because it turned into a national case study. Not only of a Supermax prison, but of what happens when a state tries to reverse one of the harshest correctional models in the country. For reform advocates, Tamms was proof that a state could shut down a Supermax without collapsing prison safety. For Supermax supporters, it was a warning that politics and budgets could force closures, even if officials believed the facility still served a purpose. This is why Tamms is often described in coverage and advocacy work as a major moment in the American solitary confinement debate. But here is what made Tamms unique. It wasn't closed because the state admitted the model was wrong. It was closed through a mix of pressures: cost, legal conflict, public campaigning, and the growing discomfort around extreme isolation. And after the shutdown, both sides kept asking the same question in different forms. Did closing Tamms improve the system, or simply redistribute the same practices into other prisons? Because in corrections, you can close a building, but you may not automatically close the policy culture that built it. This concern appeared repeatedly in discussions about where transferred prisoners would be held and how high-security control units might operate in other facilities. So even in Tamms' absence, the state still had to solve the operational reality it once used Tamms for. High-risk classifications, alleged gang leadership, serious disciplinary histories, prisoners accused of organizing violence inside prisons, and now Illinois had to manage all of that without its dedicated Supermax facility. That is when the Tamms question evolved into something bigger than Tamms. If extreme isolation is harmful, what is the alternative? For years, critics had argued that the alternative was not simply less security. It was better systems, including stronger mental health screening and treatment real classification reviews with clear criteria step-down pathways that allow prisoners to earn movement out of extreme restriction, more staff training for managing disruption without relying only on isolation in many countries outside the United States. Long-term solitary confinement is far less common, and international bodies have argued that prolonged isolation can amount to cruel treatment. In 2011, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture stated that solitary confinement beyond 15 days should be prohibited, except in very exceptional circumstances, an idea later reflected in the UN's updated Nelson Mandela Rules, which define prolonged solitary confinement as more than 15 consecutive days. These standards became part of the conversation around Supermax prisons in general, and Tamms was constantly referenced because it represented the American extreme. So in the years after closure, Tamms showed up again and again, not because it was still open, but because it symbolized an era where correctional systems believed the strongest solution was removal from people. Then, another shift happened. The public discussion around solitary confinement didn't stay confined to advocacy groups and prison watchdogs. It started entering mainstream political and legal debate across multiple states and at the federal level, as lawsuits, investigative journalism, and public testimony increasingly focused on the psychological effects of long-term isolation. Tamms, even as a closed facility, remained one of the most prominent reference points for this era of reform pressure. And that led to one final turning point in the Tamms story. Even if Illinois closed its Supermax, the human consequences did not end at the prison gates. Because when people leave extreme isolation, whether to another prison, a lower security unit, or even release, they have to rebuild something many people take for granted: normal social functioning. And that transition is not automatic. So Tamms ended as a building, but as a warning about what isolation can become when it turns into routine policy. Its story was only beginning to reach the wider public. And that leaves the biggest unresolved question of all. If Tamms was America's forgotten Supermax, what other systems today are still operating the same way, but simply haven't become famous yet? By the time Tamms shut down in January 2013, it had already left a permanent mark on Illinois. Not because it was the biggest prison in the state, but because it represented an entire philosophy that the best way to handle extreme risk was extreme separation. Tamms was built during a period when many U.S. states were expanding Supermax facilities. The idea was straightforward: remove the worst cases from everyone else, and the whole system becomes safer. And for years, that argument carried real power. But Tamms also showed the limits of that idea. Because when the state used isolation as its core strategy, it created a place that became difficult to defend under public scrutiny, especially as outside observers raised concerns about long-term segregation, mental health consequences, and the lack of clear pathways back to normal prison life. In the end, Tamms did not fall because of one single moment. It closed because multiple pressures collided at once. Illinois' budget crisis forced hard decisions. Advocacy groups brought national attention to solitary confinement. Legal action slowed the closure, but did not stop it. Public debate kept growing until Tamms was no longer seen as just another prison, and the closing itself was simple. The last Supermax prisoners were transferred on December 28, 2012. The facility officially closed on January 4, 2013. But Tamms did not end the Supermax model. It raised a bigger issue that still exists today. A prison can be shut down, but the policies behind it may not disappear. Tamms became a symbol of how quickly a system can normalize extreme conditions when the public isn't watching closely, and how long it can take to reverse course once that system is built. Tamms Correctional Center was once described as a solution, a facility built for control, for safety, for the hardest cases. But history shows something more complicated. Tamms became a mirror, reflecting how fear, politics, and institutional pressure can shape punishment in ways that are difficult to measure, difficult to justify, and even harder to undo. It also forced a national conversation. What does long-term isolation do to a person? Who decides when it is necessary? And what happens when temporary becomes routine? Tamms is called America's Forgotten Supermax because it operated far from public view for years, in a quiet area of southern Illinois, behind a system designed to keep people out of sight. But it should not be forgotten, because the story of Tamms isn't really about one building. It's about the choices governments make when they believe control matters more than accountability, and the long shadow those choices can leave behind. If you found this documentary useful, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments.